city was shrouded in a blanket of mist, the kind that clung to the skin and set shivers down the spine. Streetlights flickered weakly against the dark, their light barely piercing the dense fog that had settled over the empty streets. The cold was biting, seeping into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be caught outside. But for the stray dog padding silently along the cracked pavement, this was just another night in an endless string of nights. His fur, once a vibrant brown, was now matted and dull, caked with the grime of the city streets. He was thin, his ribs visible beneath his coat, a testament to the harsh life he led. Each breath he took was a small puff of steam in the chilly air. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned his surroundings constantly, always on the lookout for danger, or for food. He had no name, no collar, no home. The streets were all he knew, and he had learned to navigate them with a keen instinct for survival. As he moved through the city, his nose twitched, picking up scents from the various alleys and doorways he passed. The faint smell of garbage was always present, a mixture of old food and decay that lingered in the air. He paused now and then to investigate, but there was little to be found. The cold weather had driven most of the humans indoors, and the bins had already been picked clean by other strays. He continued his journey, weaving through the deserted streets, his paws making barely a sound on the damp pavement. The city was his, in a way. He knew its hidden corners, its secret paths, and the places where a dog like him could find a moment of peace. But tonight, there was no peace to be found, only the biting cold and the oppressive silence of the mist-covered city. As the night wore on, the dog found himself in a part of the city that was particularly desolate. The buildings here were old, their windows broken, and their walls covered in graffiti. Few people ventured into this area, and even fewer returned. But the dog had no fear. To him, this was just another part of his territory, another stretch of road that might yield something useful. He rounded a corner and paused. The fog had thickened, obscuring his vision, but he could sense something different, something out of place. He sniffed the air, his ears perked up, and his muscles tensed. There was a faint sound, barely audible over the silence, but it was enough to catch his attention. He moved forward cautiously, his senses heightened, ready for anything. As he approached the source of the sound, he realized it was coming from a narrow alley, a place where the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like a second skin. He hesitated for a moment, then moved closer, drawn by the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper. The dog entered the alley, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. At the far end, huddled against the wall, was a small bundle. He approached slowly, his nose twitching as he tried to identify the source of the sound. As he drew closer, the whimper became clearer, more distinct. It was a sound he had never heard before, a sound that stirred something deep within him. He finally reached the bundle and nudged it gently with his nose. The fabric shifted, revealing a tiny, pale face as a baby, swaddled in a dirty blanket, left alone in the cold night. The dog stared at the infant, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The baby whimpered again, a weak, pitiful sound that seemed to echo off the walls of the alley. The dog stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the helpless infant before him. In his world of survival and instinct, this was something entirely new, something beyond his understanding. But the baby's soft cries cut through the night, pulling at a part of him that had long been buried beneath the harsh realities of life on the streets. He sniffed the baby carefully, his cold nose brushing against the small face. The child was shivering, the blanket barely offering any protection against the biting cold. The dog, though hardened by the streets, felt a strange, inexplicable urge to protect this fragile creature. He had seen many things in his life, other strays fighting for scraps, humans passing by without a second glance, but never something so vulnerable, so in need of help. He nudged the blanket again, trying to wrap it more securely around the baby, but his paws were clumsy, and the fabric slipped through his grip. The child whimpered louder, a sound that sent a pang through the dog's chest. He had to do something, anything, to help. But what could a stray dog do in a situation like this? The dog looked around the alley, his ears pricked for any sound, any sign of help. The city was eerily quiet, as if the world had forgotten this little corner of existence. He knew he couldn't leave the baby alone, not in this cold, not with the night pressing in around them. But he also knew he couldn't stay here, helpless and unable to offer more than his body warmth. With a sense of urgency, the dog made a decision. He began to bark, sharp, loud barks that echoed off the walls of the alley, bouncing into the empty streets beyond. He barked again and again, his voice growing hoarse, but no one came. The baby's cries grew weaker, and panic began to set in. The dog's barks turned frantic, a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to hear and come to their aid. But the streets remained silent. The dog paused, his chest heaving from the effort. His mind raced, searching for another solution. He couldn't abandon the baby, but staying here alone wouldn't save them. He had to find someone, anyone, who could help. In a final, desperate attempt, the dog ran out of the alley and into the open street, barking as loud as he could. He darted back and forth, hoping to catch the attention of a passerby. The few humans still outside were too far away or too engrossed in their own lives to notice the frantic animal. The dog returned to the alley, fear gripping him as he saw the baby's breathing grow more shallow. He knew he was running out of time. With renewed determination, the dog decided to venture farther, running towards a more populated area. He stopped at every corner, every street light, barking and yelping, trying to draw attention. But time was slipping away, and hope was fading. Finally, as the dog's energy waned and his spirit began to falter, he spotted a figure in the distance. A man, slouched and weary, was making his way down the sidewalk. The dog hesitated for just a moment before bolting toward him, barking with every ounce of strength he had left. The man, startled, looked down at the dog, a stray, scruffy, and clearly in distress. But there was something in the dog's eyes, a look of urgency that the man couldn't ignore. The man looked down at the dog with a mix of curiosity and concern. His clothes were tattered, and his face was weathered by years of hardship. He was a fixture of the city's underbelly, a shadow among the many who wandered the streets at night. The dog, desperate and determined, barked again, tugging at the man's frayed pant leg with gentle urgency. At first, the man didn't understand. He had seen plenty of stray dogs in his time, but this one was different. There was something almost human in its desperation. The man hesitated, then followed the dog's lead, his curiosity piqued. The dog darted ahead, looking back every few steps to make sure the man was following. It led him down the street, through a maze of alleys, until they reached the narrow passage where the baby lay. As they approached the alley, the man heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible cry. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. When they reached the end of the alley, the man froze, his eyes widening in shock. There, lying on the cold, hard ground, was a tiny baby wrapped in a dirty, threadbare blanket. The man dropped to his knees beside the child, his rough hands trembling as he carefully lifted the infant into his arms. The baby was cold to the touch, its skin pale and lips tinged with blue. The man's breath caught in his throat as he realized the gravity of the situation. This baby was on the brink of death, and there was no time to waste. He looked at the dog, who was now sitting quietly beside him, its eyes filled with an intelligence and awareness that seemed almost otherworldly. The man knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't take the baby to a hospital, he had no means of transportation, no money, and he was a nobody in this vast, uncaring city. But he couldn't just leave the child to die. The man wrapped the baby more tightly in the blanket, holding it close to his chest as he stood up. His mind raced as he tried to think of a solution. He knew a few people in the city, others like him who lived on the fringes of society, but they wouldn't be able to help. He needed someone who could get the baby to safety, someone who would care. Without another moment's hesitation, the man made his decision. He began walking, his steps purposeful despite the weight of the situation. The dog followed closely, its eyes never leaving the baby. The man knew of a nearby shelter, a place where the homeless could find a meal and a bed for the night. It wasn't much, but it was something, and maybe, just maybe, there would be someone there who could help. The journey to the shelter felt like an eternity. The streets were empty, the city's inhabitants long gone to the warmth of their homes. The man kept his pace steady, his breath visible in the cold night air. The baby was silent now, its breathing shallow and uneven. The man's heart ached with every step, but he pushed forward, driven by a sense of duty he hadn't felt in years. Finally, the shelter came into view, a small, dilapidated building nestled between two larger structures. The lights inside were dim, but they offered a beacon of hope in the darkness. The man quickened his pace, relief flooding his senses as he neared the entrance. He pounded on the door, his fists hitting the worn wood with a sense of urgency. The dog sat beside him, its eyes reflecting the dim light as it watched the door intently. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and a middle-aged woman with tired eyes peered out. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice gruff from years of dealing with the city's downtrodden. The man said nothing at first. He simply held out the baby, the child's small form almost lost in the folds of the blanket. The woman's eyes widened, and she quickly pulled the door open wider, motioning for them to come inside. The man stepped into the warmth of the shelter, the dog following close behind. The woman took the baby from his arms, her hands gentle but firm as she examined the infant. Her expression softened, and she glanced up at the man, her voice filled with concern. "Where did you find this child?" she asked, her tone now more urgent. The man gestured to the dog. "It was the dog," he said quietly. "It led me to the baby." The woman looked at the dog, her brow furrowing in confusion, but she didn't ask any more questions. She turned and hurried toward the back of the shelter, cradling the baby as she went. The dog watched the woman disappear into the back room, his tail wagging slightly as if sensing that the baby was now in good hands. The man, too, stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do next. The shelter was warm, and the faint smell of soup wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the harsh cold outside. For a brief moment, he considered staying, perhaps asking for a meal or a place to rest. But something held him back, perhaps it was the dog, now sitting patiently by the door, or the nagging feeling that he didn't quite belong here. The woman soon returned, her expression still serious but with a hint of relief. "The baby's stable for now," she said. "We've called an ambulance. They'll take the child to the hospital where it can get the care it needs." The man nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He glanced down at the dog, who was looking up at him with those same intelligent eyes. The woman followed his gaze and smiled softly. "You've done something remarkable tonight," she said, though it was unclear if she was addressing the man, the dog, or both. The man shifted uncomfortably, not used to such praise. "It was the dog," he repeated. "I just followed." The woman looked at the dog, her smile growing. "Well, it seems you two make a good team," she said. "The baby wouldn't have made it without you." The man didn't respond, but inside, he felt something stir, an old, forgotten sense of pride, buried beneath years of hardship. He had always seen himself as a man alone, drifting through life with no real purpose. But tonight, with this dog by his side, he had done something that mattered. He glanced at the dog again, wondering where it had come from, what its story was. The dog had clearly been living on the streets, just like him, but there was something different about it. This wasn't just a stray looking for food, This dog had a sense of purpose, a determination that he hadn't seen in a long time. The woman interrupted his thoughts. "You should stay here for the night," she said gently. "It's cold out, and you both look like you could use some rest." The man hesitated, then nodded. He was tired, and the idea of a warm bed, even if just for one night, was too tempting to refuse. The dog seemed to agree, as it settled down by the door, its eyes slowly closing as the exhaustion of the night finally caught up with it. The woman led the man to a small room at the back of the shelter, offering him a thin blanket and a place to sleep. He thanked her quietly, lying down on the cot and pulling the blanket up to his chin. The dog followed him into the room, curling up on the floor beside the cot. As he lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, the events of the night replayed in his mind. He had saved a life, a fragile, innocent life that had been left to die in the cold. And he had done it with the help of a dog, a creature as lost and forgotten as he was. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of connection, of belonging, that he had thought was lost forever. As he drifted off to sleep, the dog's quiet breathing a comforting presence in the small room, the man couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be facing it alone. Morning broke with a soft, gray light filtering through the small window of the shelter. The city outside was waking up slowly, shaking off the cold grip of the night. Inside the shelter, the man stirred on his cot, his body stiff from a restless sleep. The dog, already awake, sat quietly by the door, its ears perked up as it listened to the sounds of the world outside. The events of the previous night came rushing back to the man as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He glanced down at the dog, who met his gaze with a calm, steady look. There was a silent understanding between them now, a bond forged in the darkness of the alley. The man knew that without the dog, the baby might never have been found, and that thought filled him with a deep sense of gratitude. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and the door to the small room creaked open. The woman from the night before stepped inside, her expression softer in the morning light. She carried a tray with a bowl of warm oatmeal and a piece of bread, a simple breakfast, but one that the man hadn't had in a long time. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray down on the cot. "How are you feeling?" The man nodded, sitting up slowly. "Better, thank you," he replied, his voice still rough from sleep. He glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved from its spot by the door. "And the baby?" The woman smiled gently. "The ambulance took the baby to the hospital last night. The doctors said it's going to be fine, thanks to you and your friend here." The man felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He looked at the dog again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The woman noticed and knelt down to scratch the dog behind its ears, earning a soft wag of the tail in return. "He's a good dog," she said, her voice full of admiration. "It's not every day you see something like that. You both did something amazing." The man ate his breakfast slowly, savoring each bite as the woman continued to talk. She told him about the shelter, how they helped people who had nowhere else to go, and how they always had room for those who needed it. The man listened quietly, grateful for the kindness, but unsure if he belonged in this place. When he finished eating, the woman took the tray and stood up. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," she said, her tone inviting. "But I understand if you feel like you need to move on. Just know that you're always welcome here." The man nodded, appreciating her offer but feeling a pull to leave. The streets were his home, after all, and he had grown used to the freedom they offered. But as he stood up and stretched, he looked down at the dog, who was still watching him with those intelligent eyes. He knew that leaving now would mean leaving the dog behind, and that was something he wasn't sure he could do. Before he could make a decision, the sound of voices drifted through the shelter. The man and the dog both turned toward the door, listening intently. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and the woman's expression shifted to one of concern. "They're here," she said quietly, as if speaking to herself. The man frowned, confused. "Who?" Before the woman could answer, the door to the shelter was pushed open, and 2 police officers stepped inside. They were accompanied by a social worker, a stern-looking woman with a clipboard in hand. The man's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The social worker approached the woman who had helped the baby, her expression all business. "We're here to investigate the report of an abandoned child," she said, her voice clipped. "I understand you were the one who found the baby." The woman nodded, her calm demeanor faltering slightly. "Yes, but it wasn't me who found the child." "It was him," she said, pointing to the man and the dog. The officers turned their attention to the man and the dog, their expressions unreadable. The man felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never had much trust in authority figures, and the sight of the police made him uneasy. But the social worker's next words caught him off guard. "We need to take statements from everyone involved," she said. "And we need to determine the best course of action for the dog." The man's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with fear. The social worker glanced at the dog, then back at the man. "This dog has done something extraordinary," she said. "But we need to make sure it's taken care of. Stray animals aren't allowed to roam the streets, especially ones that are involved in situations like this. We need to find it a home." The man's mind raced. He had only just met the dog, but the thought of it being taken away filled him with dread. He knew the dog didn't belong in a shelter or with strangers. It belonged with him. But he also knew he had no claim over the animal, no way to ensure its safety. Before he could speak, the woman from the shelter stepped forward. "The dog belongs with him," she said firmly, gesturing to the man. "They found the baby together. They belong together." The officers exchanged glances, then looked back at the man. One of them nodded slowly. "We'll need to document everything," he said. "But if you're willing to take responsibility for the dog, there's no reason it can't stay with you." The man felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by uncertainty. He had lived alone for so long, surviving day by day, that the thought of caring for another being was daunting. But as he looked down at the dog, who was watching him with those same loyal eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. "I'll take care of him," the man said quietly, his voice filled with determination. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The story of the baby's rescue spread quickly through the city, and soon, the man and the dog found themselves at the center of attention. Reporters came to the shelter, eager to capture the story of the unlikely hero. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in their faces, but through it all, the dog remained calm, staying close to the man's side. The man, however, was overwhelmed. He had lived in the shadows for so long that the sudden attention was disorienting. He answered questions as best he could, always giving credit to the dog, who had been the true savior that night. The reporters were fascinated by the dog's story, and soon, offers began to pour in, people wanting to adopt the dog, to give it a home. But the man knew that the dog had already found its home, with him. They had been through too much together to be separated now. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and the thought of parting ways was unthinkable. One day, as the media frenzy began to die down, the woman from the shelter approached the man with a small smile. "You've become quite the local hero," she said, her tone teasing. The man shook his head, still uncomfortable with the attention. "It was all the dog," he insisted. The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Maybe so," she said, "but you were the one who followed him, the one who made sure that baby got the help it needed. You've both done something remarkable." The man looked down at the dog, who was sitting quietly at his feet. He had always considered himself an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the world of normal people. But now, with this dog by his side, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to the man. "This came for you today," she said. "It's from the family of the baby you saved." The man hesitated, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note, written in neat handwriting. It thanked him for his bravery, for the kindness he had shown in saving their child. Along with the note was a photograph of the baby, now healthy and safe, wrapped in a warm blanket and held in the arms of its parents. Tears welled up in the man's eyes as he stared at the photo. He had saved a life that had been so close to slipping away. And he had done it with the help of a dog, a stray that had found him just when he needed it most. The woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've given that family a gift they can never repay," she said softly. "And in doing so, you found something for yourself, too." The man nodded, unable to speak. He looked down at the dog, who wagged its tail in response, as if sensing the emotion in the air. The man knew that he had found more than just a companion in this dog. He had found a purpose, a reason to keep going, even in the darkest of times. As the man and the dog sat together in the shelter, the world outside continued to move on, but for them, time seemed to stand still. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and together, they had done something truly extraordinary. And as the man looked into the dog's eyes, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in both of their lives. The days turned into weeks, and life for the man and the dog slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The shelter had become a temporary home for them both, offering a place of refuge and warmth that neither had known in a long time. But the man knew that this arrangement couldn't last forever. The shelter was meant for those in need, and now that things had calmed down, he felt a pull to move on, to find a place where they could start fresh. The dog had become his constant companion, following him wherever he went. They explored the city together, walking through the parks and down the busy streets, side by side. The man found himself talking to the dog as they walked, sharing his thoughts and worries as if the dog could understand every word. And in a way, it seemed like the dog did. Its quiet presence was a comfort, a steady reminder that he wasn't alone. One afternoon, as they wandered through a quieter part of the city, the man noticed a small, run-down house with a "for rent" sign in the window. It was nothing special, just a simple, single-story home with peeling paint and a yard that had seen better days. But something about it caught the man's eye. It was unassuming, like him, a place that had been forgotten but still held potential. He stood in front of the house for a long moment, the dog sitting patiently by his side. Could this be the place they were looking for? A real home, where they could build a new life together. The man's heart pounded as he considered the possibility. It was a risk, a big step for someone who had lived on the streets for so long, but it felt right. With a deep breath, the man took down the number from the sign and made the call. The landlord was an older gentleman, kind and understanding, who didn't ask too many questions. Within a week, the papers were signed, and the man and the dog moved into their new home. The house was small and a bit shabby, but it was theirs. The first night, as the man lay on the old, creaky bed in the bedroom, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The dog curled up at the foot of the bed, its soft snores filling the quiet room. For the first time in a long time, the man felt like he belonged somewhere, like he had a place in the world. Over the next few days, the man and the dog settled into their new routine. They spent their mornings exploring the neighborhood, meeting the locals, and their afternoons fixing up the house. The man worked slowly, carefully repairing the things that were broken and making the space their own. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way that he hadn't experienced in years. The dog was always by his side, offering silent companionship as the man painted the walls, patched up the roof, and cleared the overgrown yard. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and that was enough. One evening, as the sun set behind the house, casting long shadows across the yard, the man sat on the front porch, the dog resting at his feet. The air was cool, and the sounds of the city seemed far away. The man looked out at the street, at the life they were building together, and felt a deep sense of contentment. The dog lifted its head and looked up at the man, its eyes reflecting the fading light. The man reached down and scratched behind its ears, smiling as the dog leaned into the touch. "We're going to be just fine," the man said quietly, his voice filled with a confidence that had been absent for so long. And in that moment, sitting on the porch of their little house, the man knew that they had finally found what they had been searching for, a place to call home, and a life worth living. As the months passed, the story of the dog that had saved a baby continued to circulate through the city. Though the initial media frenzy had died down, the tale left a lasting impression on those who heard it. The dog had become something of a local legend, a symbol of loyalty, bravery, and the unexpected ways in which life can surprise you. The man often found himself approached by strangers on the street, people who had heard about the rescue and wanted to express their admiration or gratitude. Some offered to buy him a meal or give him money, but he always politely declined. He didn't need much now that he had a home and his faithful companion by his side. What he valued most was the peace he had found, the sense of purpose that had come from saving a life and building a new one. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed simply to the man and his dog. Inside was an invitation to a local community event, an awards ceremony for those who had made a significant impact on the neighborhood. The man was surprised to see his and the dog's names listed among the honorees. The event organizers wanted to recognize the courage and compassion that had saved the baby's life. The man hesitated, unsure if he wanted to step back into the spotlight. He had grown accustomed to their quiet life, free from the attention that had followed the rescue. But as he looked down at the dog, who had been the true hero of that night, he knew that this recognition was important, not for him, but for the dog. This was a chance to honor the bond they had formed and the journey they had taken together. On the day of the ceremony, the man dressed in the best clothes he had, simple but clean. He gave the dog an extra brush, making sure its coat was as neat as possible. Together, they walked to the community center, where the event was being held. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation as people gathered to celebrate those who had made a difference. When the man and the dog arrived, they were greeted with warm smiles and applause. The dog, sensing the positive energy, wagged its tail and looked up at the man as if to say, "We did it." The man felt a swell of pride as they were guided to the front of the room, where a small stage had been set up. As the event began, the organizers took turns speaking about the various honorees, each story inspiring in its own way. When it was time for the man and the dog to be recognized, the room fell silent. The organizer who had sent the invitation stepped forward, holding a small plaque in her hands. "Tonight, we honor not just a man, but a bond between a man and his dog that led to the saving of a precious life," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "In a moment of crisis, they showed us the power of loyalty, courage, and the unexpected heroes who walk among us every day." She turned to the man and the dog, her smile wide. "For your bravery, and for reminding us all of the good that exists in this world, we present this award to you both." The room erupted in applause as the man stepped forward, the dog by his side. He accepted the plaque with a quiet nod, his heart full. The dog stood proudly beside him, as if it understood the significance of the moment. As the applause died down, the man looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who had come to celebrate this moment with them. He realized that this wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was hope, there was light, and there was a reason to keep going. After the ceremony, People gathered around to congratulate the man and to pet the dog, who accepted the attention with its usual calm demeanor. The man smiled as he watched the dog interact with the crowd, knowing that their journey together was far from over. That night, as they walked back to their little house, the man felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had found a place where they belonged, a community that valued them, and a future that was bright with possibilities. And as they climbed the steps to their front porch, the man knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, two unlikely heroes who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. The legacy of the heroic dog would live on, not just in the hearts of those who had heard the story, but in the bond that had formed between the man and his loyal companion. And as they settled in for the night, the man couldn't help but feel grateful for the dog, for their new life, and for the chance to start again.